Hello and welcome to the Business Interview. I'm Annette Young. It's a phrase that fills many with dread. I'm talking about a double dip recession. Across the world, stock markets continue to slide thanks to ongoing pessimism about weak growth in the United States, not to mention combined with the long-standing worries about the Eurozone's debt crisis. And commentators are now openly talking about the odds of a double dip in the next year as perhaps being as high as 50%. Joining me here in the studio is Professor Katalin Lubachinski, the President of the European Money and Finance Forum. Professor Lubachinski, thanks so much for being with us. To begin with, the factors such as the weak economic growth in the United States, of course, as well as the Eurozone debt crisis, these are issues that have been around for a while. What actually has caused or triggered this massive panic attack in the markets?
I would say nothing in particular, but a little bit of everything. It's just a combination of different factors. What you have, there's no economic fundamental news that has triggered this.
Because the fundamentals really haven't changed, have they?
They haven't changed. What you have to understand is the timing for financial markets is not at all the timing for politicians or economics. Financial markets are driven by short-termism, and therefore a tiny piece of news can completely make the strategies change. Furthermore, remember that nothing has been done since the last financial crisis about accounting standards and the mark-to-market accounting methods. And these are dramatic because as soon as a price drops, then the bank has, or the institutional investor has a loss. And because it has a loss, its own stock will decline. And because it declines, then investors will sell them. And then you're entering a vicious circle and you're eventually having some panic. What you have to keep in mind is financial markets are bipolar. You go from overconfidence to over-mistrust in a couple of weeks' time. It's always overreaction that we have.
It seems like all these investors across the world are hitting the sell button, aren't they?
Yeah, but why? Because everyone hates uncertainty, and there's a major difference between uncertainty and risk. Risk, you can assess the probabilities. Now we're in a state where everything is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen, and we can't find probabilities of what's going to happen.
Are the markets also finally waking up to the fact that while countries are needing to get out of debt, they're also going to have to kill growth in the process?
Well, that's the major problem. The financial crisis that started in 2007 became an economic crisis. Public debt has replaced private debt. And to avoid big recessions, most countries have had policies with lots of public spending to sustain growth. Now, if you have that kind of policies, then automatically you have an increased budget deficit and an increased debt ratio to GDP. Now, people are really worrying in Europe and in the US on the numbers we have, on average slightly more than 100% of GDP for the public debt. Keep in mind that in Japan, that ratio is 220%. And nobody is screaming their head off about this.
But in fact, there was a piece in The Economist that's just been published, which actually is equating Japan with what's going on with the US, that the US could find itself, like Japan, a stagnant economy as such.
Well, that's the problem. If you cut the spending, then you're having a policy that will not encourage growth, and you have a probability of going back into recession. Furthermore, if you want to really decrease your budget deficit and stop your public debt increase, then you have to increase taxes. And this is a policy debate that you have in the US between Republicans and Democrats.
So are we in danger of heading into a double dip recession?
We could enter that kind of recession if governments increase taxes and decrease spending, because credit rating agencies want them to have a reduced budget deficit. And I think the timing is not appropriate.
So the age of austerity is not good for financial markets. This is the time to be prompting and doing whatever you can to motivate economic stimulus and not cutting government expenditure. Right?
Yes, but markets are contradictory because they don't want to have that kind of policy, but they don't want a budget deficit and they don't want to buy those public debts. And we need investors to buy the public debt if you want to have policy that increases spending.
So are you going to see a spillover effect from what's happening now in the markets into the real economy?
Well, it could happen like it happened in 2007. We had an economic crisis after the financial crisis.
Crunch in 2008.
Yeah, and that could occur again, yes, obviously.
So what does it mean for the average person, therefore?
For the average person, it's very simple. The unemployment will rise. You have to keep in mind that in Spain, the unemployment rate is 20%. The official one in the US is 10%, and they don't measure unemployment like we do in Europe. If we'd have the same kind of measurement, the rate would be much higher, I think. So that's for one thing. And the second thing is that it might be difficult to have credit because banks have to deleverage. So that's another constraint that can occur.
Professor Liboczynski, let's look at the two big factors that are driving all of this, one being the US markets and the view of the US, and the other being the Eurozone. First of all, this week's fiscal brinkmanship in Washington, which eventually, right at the last minute, led to the raising of the debt ceiling, surely that must have tarnished America's image abroad and has no doubt contributed to what we've been seeing in the markets.
I'm not sure, because it was a political game, and I think most institutional investors knew it was a political game. It was a dangerous political game, but it was a game. Remember, elections are soon to come, so Republicans have to show their differences with Democrats. So it was political war, and that was it. It was obvious that they were not going to default.
But having said that, leading up to that, I mean, the markets were very jittery, weren't they?
The markets were upset and the markets were relatively uncertain. And as I say, they hate uncertainty. So every time uncertainty increases, volatility increases.
Now, across on the other side of the Atlantic, you've got European leaders who stand accused of being irresponsibly slow when it came to reacting to the debt crisis in Europe. In your opinion, what could they have done and what can they still do?
Well, the difficulty with the Europe is you have several governments and they have to agree together. And then, like in any group, you have those who are rich and those who are poor. The rich have to help the poor, and always that poses a problem. And it's the problem with the Eurobond that has to be set up very quickly. It's very important.
And for the first time, we're now hearing the European Commission talking seriously about it.
Finally, we're hearing about that. But you have to understand that when Europe issues a Eurobond, that means that Germans are going to pay more for their debt, and Greeks, let's say Greeks, are going to pay less. So Greeks are happy, Germans are not. And you have to cooperate. And the big uncertainty in Europe is how much is the cooperation going to hold through time.
And one possible victim of all this could be the euro, could it not?
No, hopefully not, because I think every country has understood that if it opts out of Europe, then their economic situation is going to be dramatic and they're going to have a huge recession, a huge problem to finance their debt, and etc. So, I mean, it's not a solution.
Do you see let me rephrase that. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel in all of this?
I'm always optimistic, so I say there would be a light because we do see Europe cooperate. The Americans have increased the ceiling for the debt, so that gives governments some more time to implement solutions. let's just hope that they will do implement the solutions they have thought about, which are, some of them are good solutions. So the timing of governments is always longer than the timing of financial markets.
And for European leaders, what do you hope will come from them in response to what's going on now in the markets?
Well, maybe we're going to have a real European budget.
Could you expand a bit more in that sense? What do you mean when you refer to that?
Well, the difficulty with the Europe as such is it has one monetary policy, but it has different budget policies. So there's a problem of coordination and coherence between the two. If Europe has had its own budget, it could decide on its own for all the governments at once, and it would be more coherent with the monetary policy.
Do you think there's the odds of that happening, given the fact that it's been tough enough as it is to get them to move quickly to responding to the debt crisis?
No, the odds are very remote, unfortunately.
Professor Libaczynski, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. That's it for this edition of the Business Interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines which are coming up shortly.